Hi, I'm George Watchorn, Divisional Partner and Land Agent in Brown&Co. Welcome to the first in a series of short videos that look at the upcoming changes in agricultural policy and the implications for many farmers across the UK. This video focuses on the impending reduction to the basic payment scheme and how farmers might mitigate those impacts going forward. So today I've got Paul Waberski, partner in our Melton Mowbray office, and Anita Riggle, Senior Associate in our Brigg office, to discuss these potential impacts. So, shall we take a walk?
Thank you, George.
So Paul, can you give us a recap of where we are at the moment?
Sure. So we find ourselves in this time frame which is called the transition period, which runs from 2021 to 2027. In that period, the BPS payments reduce in stages. We know what those reductions are going to be from 2021 to 2024. We've been given those. And come 2024, we're going to be roughly at about 50% of where we were before. What we don't know is what those downward steps are going to be from 2024 to 2028. But we do know come 2028, there will be zero payments. Okay. The reason why that's so important for us as farm business managers is that the BPS payments for the vast majority of farm businesses amounts to a big proportion of profit. And what I mean by that is if you took the accounts and took out the BPS payment, most businesses won't make a profit. So that's why we need to focus now during the transition period to mitigate that reduction of payments. That's not the only thing that's happening at the moment. There's other changes afoot as well. And Anita, you know more about that.
Yeah, and as Paul said, the reduction in BPS is going to impact both rents and tenants personally, which I think we can talk about that a little bit later on. But there's also the Agriculture Act 2020, which is bringing in tenancy reforms, and that's going to have a bigger impact on Agricultural Holdings Act tenants and their succession processes as well.
So what do we think the biggest challenges facing the agricultural industry over the next 3 to 4 years?
From a financial point of view, George, I think there's three key elements we all need to consider. First is the loss of income. How the loss of BPS is going to affect our profit and loss, our net farm income, call it what you want, how we mitigate that loss of income. Second point is cash flow, how we manage our cash flow. For years we've got used to that payment landing in December, or for most of us landing in December on time. We've structured our HP repayments around it and all sorts of other sort of financial repayments. Then thirdly is how we manage our relationship with the banks, I suppose giving them confidence in the fact that we are managing the loss of income and also managing our cash flow. And importantly for them is that our businesses will be sustainable in the future and will be able to make those debt repayments. So in summary, three things: the loss of income, how we deal with that; secondly, cash flow, how we deal with that; and thirdly, how we communicate with the banks that our businesses are sustainable going forward if we get the first two right.
And in addition to Paul's comments about how the loss of BPS will affect businesses, it really needs to be at the forefront of everybody's minds when they are tendering for rents, whether that be the rent itself or the terms of the tenancy and the break clauses or the rent reviews that are put forward. Saying that, we have not yet seen in the market a fall in the levels of rents tendered, which we were expecting.
So Paul, how can farmers plan and manage their cash flow?
It's actually quite straightforward, George, and it's something which we've been talking about for ages. You need to do a budget. You need to do a budget, and included in the budget needs to be a cash flow. And so many times when you mention the word budget to a farmer, they say, well, how can I budget because we don't know what crop prices are going to be? That's partially true. We know what our costs are, so we can do a budget and we can do a detailed cash flow. And at Brown&Co, obviously, we've got a model that we can use, which helps farmers to do that. So we can put in detailed costs. Once we've got our detailed costs in, we then know what our selling structure needs to be, bearing in mind what we said earlier, that BPS is going to disappear. So we then know where we've got our peaks and troughs, so we can actually align our sales to meet those financial demands. And the other thing, you know, with doing a budget and sitting down and doing it the year ahead, you know, we can change the future before it happens. So if we sit down and do a budget and it doesn't look like we're going to make a sufficient profit, let's do something else. Let's look at the areas that we can improve on. And then the other thing, what a budget helps us do is tells us what is a good price. So we don't know if the price of wheat is £150 a tonne a good price, or is 180. You know, what does it need to be? Until we know our costs, until we've got it all written down, we don't know, you know, whether it's a good point or a bad point to sell. And once we've got that all laid out, we've got the control to make proactive, positive decisions as to how we sell our products and when.
And how does the financial planning affect the relationship between the client and the bank?
It's an interesting point, George. So I think there's one thing to get clear as well at the outset, because the industry has changed quite a bit in the last few years. Historically, with farmers, as long as you had sufficient security, banks were quite happy to keep lending. However, there's been a major sort of shift where banks now need to see serviceability. So that is, regardless of how much equity you've got, you need to be able to service the loans that you've got, which is going to be a challenge with the loss of BPS. So if you can predict your performance, it gives greater confidence with the bank, as in you can show how it's going to go over the next year, that sort of confidence in the business that you can actually service the debts that you've got to make sort of repayments with. And that's the same as if you are going to embark on some different diversification projects. You've got to sort of understand how it's going to be funded and how the funding of those projects is going to affect the cash flow.
And we are suggesting to our farm business clients, in order to help service those loans that they've got and to help replace some of that BPS income that is being lost, to seek out other opportunities. And it could be prudent that they speak to their bank manager and get some funding towards diversification opportunities, whether they be on farm or off farm, such as renewable energy projects, which we're seeing quite a lot, bed and breakfast pigs if you've got some spare buildings, or holiday lets if you've got some traditional buildings somewhere. And I think what's really important, and as Paul has also mentioned, is about instilling confidence in your bank manager that you're able to fund this project and continue keeping this project rolling. And in needing to speak to your land agents or your planning consultants or your agribusiness consultants all helps instill that confidence in your bank manager through research and detailed planning. Another point that's really important to note is that if you're planning on doing your diversification project on a tenanted property, early engagement with your landlord is essential, because it's really important to ensure that an agreement is documented, that all parties are happy with, and most importantly is workable.
Another thing that's quite important, I think the banks value greatly, is if we can monitor how the plan is progressing, the financial plan, as in the cash flow. And our model budget has a facility to do monthly budget to actuals. So for some clients we meet once a year, other ones once a quarter, or even monthly sometimes, to monitor the progress of it. And when we sit down with the bank to review the funding, we can show how it's progressed and show if there's any deviations from the plan and explain why. So for example, 2020 we had all that awful weather and we had a lot less crops around to sell. So we could sit down and explain to the bank, this is the situation, this is why, and this is why we need extra funding. And I can honestly say across all of the clients that I do budgets and cash flows for, there wasn't one client that we couldn't get the additional funds from the bank because we could explain where the differences came from. You know? So I think that's a very, very valuable process to have, is the monitoring and the control during the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, shall we walk? So Anita, if a farmer wanted to change the rent they were paying for a block of land following the reduction in the BPS payment, how would a new rental figure be calculated?
That's a really good question, George. Firstly, it's important to know what sort of tenancy you've got. There's two main sorts of tenancies that we see in agriculture. The first is the Agricultural Holdings Act 1986, commonly known as the Old Style Tenancy, or the AHA. And then there is the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995, which is also known as the Farm Business Tenancy, or an FBT. Now, both of those tenancy agreements allow for the rent to be increased or decreased. but the difference is the formula and how those rents are calculated. With an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, there is a specific rent formula to calculate the rent. What is taken into consideration for that rent formula is the terms of the tenancy, the character and situation of the holding, the productive and related earning capacity. Along with those factors, all relevant income is assessed. So that might be crop sales, straw sales, livestock sales, along with the basic payment income. And obviously, as we're seeing a reduction in the basic payment, just because that is one of those relevant factors, that reduction does not necessarily mean that there will be a reduction in the rent, because other factors are taken into consideration. With the Agricultural Tenancies Act, so the farm business tenancies, it's a bit different. So what we see with those tenancies is a lot more freedom of contract between the two parties. We normally calculate those rents on comparable evidence, so neighbouring farms and what's happening in the market. But a good way of adding gravitas to a tenant or a landlord's arguments for those rents is to do a farm budget, which is what Paul tends to do. If for some reason, and hopefully this isn't the case, a landlord and tenant can't come to an agreement on a rent, whether that be evidence and different things like that, or a budgeting problem, it's referred to an arbitrator. And both parties will submit all of their evidence, so a farm business budget would form a big part of that, to the arbitrator, and then the arbitrator would set the rent for the next 3 years.
And Paul, Anita's mentioned the importance of budgeting there. Would you like to add anything?
Sure, I think specifically for the AHA type tenancies, because it relates to a holding, so to do a budget for that holding, looking at the details such as soil types, buildings, whether or not it was drained and who paid for the drainage, because if the tenant pays for the drainage, you need to exclude that. So you would use a yield in the budget, for example, of what would the farm produce if it wasn't drained. So there's quite a few important factors that you could put into it, as well as, current input prices, seed, fertilizer, sprays, because those vary so much. The price of wheat goes up, the price of fertilizer goes up. So it's important to do that detailed budget, because it gives you a really good factual negotiating starting point with the landlord, really, because without it you're all slightly sort of firing in the dark, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant. And how would a farmer go about actioning their rent review?
Yeah, again, it's a really important topic. A lot of people don't know, particularly if you haven't sought professional advice. With a rent review, what could happen is it could be done by agreement. Both parties could decide at any point during their tenancy that they would like to have a rent review, but that's got to be done by negotiation and agreement with both parties. What we see as a backstop position, and more commonly is the position, the Act dictates that a rent review cannot happen any more frequently than every 3 years. A rent review notice will be served, and that can be done by either party, and that is live from the moment that it's served. The problem with that is that if one party serves a rent review notice and it is live, let's take a tenant for example, because prices are low and they would like to reduce their rent. So they've served a rent review notice, and in that 12 months period that the rent review notice is live, prices start to increase again, like we've seen this year. A landlord could then decide that they would like to try and increase that rent. So it could backfire. What's important to note, and I've slightly just touched on there with these rent review notices, is that they are live for at least 12 months. So it's important to know the term date of your tenancy agreement, and professionals can help with that, or you might know it yourself, or it'll be stated in the agreement. A rent review notice must be served at least 12 months before that term date, but no more than 24 months before. So there's quite a while in between those two dates where the market could take effect and change the rent that could be paid, or the relevant factors around those rents. Due to the strict timing of these notices, it's really important to always be considering your next steps, and that's where Paul and ABC consultants are really important, because you need to be preparing full farm budgets to know exactly where you're going with your rents and your business well ahead of that term date.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Shall we carry on? So Paul, we've seen a huge uptake in environmental stewardship. I think our environmental team did something like 315 applications last year. Can you just touch on the type of returns that are available under the mid-tier schemes, and are there any other diversification schemes that are available?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you quite rightly say 315. It's a huge increase. Last year we did 189, so it's not quite double, but nearly. And what's very interesting, those 315 are going to generate £38.8 million for those claimants, which is a huge amount of money. And if you take that 38.8 million and look at it on a per acre or per hectare basis, which we're quite good at doing in farming, and that's on the land in the agreement, not the areas of environmental stewardship. The pounds per acre on average is £41, which I think is 102 pounds a hectare. So if you look at that and compare it to BPS, remember in 2020 the BPS payment was about £92 an acre. So those farmers have already secured virtually half of the BPS payment. And we're still in this sort of transitional zone, so they're getting BPS plus they're getting that extra £41 an acre, which makes it a real sort of incentive to get into, you know.
Definitely, and I think, as I've mentioned earlier, and I can't stress enough how important it is to be aware of the type of tenancy agreement you've got if you are a tenant. The reason why I say this is if you enter into one of these mid-tier schemes, they are for a period of 5 years. If you have a farm business tenancy and you enter into one of these agreements, and if after year 1 of that agreement you're served a notice to quit by the landlord, these notices to quit are usually for a 1-year period. So the landlord could then take on that mid-tier scheme for the remaining 4 years of the period, and they will reap the benefits, which would be unfortunate if you've put in all of the work as a tenant. On the other hand, if you are a tenant of an Agricultural Holdings Act agreement, so the old style, you have usually got security of tenure either for the tenant's lifetime or for several generations. So entering into one of these mid-tier schemes, you've got that security, and you know you've got the ability to be able to enter into it knowing that you'll be able to see it through. And it's really important, whether you are in a farm business tenancy or an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, that you get the landlord's consent. If you don't get the landlord's consent and you don't enter into those conversations with the landlord, you could find yourself in a little bit of a predicament a bit later on.
Absolutely right. If for whatever reason you want to sort of give up the tenancy, you know, where the responsibility sits. And George, you asked a question about sort of alternative diversifications. So there's a lot happening this autumn. We're waiting for a new grant scheme to be announced. You'll remember previously there were ones which have now closed, but we could potentially be seeing grant funding for projects such as direct drills or machinery and equipment, or perhaps livestock handling equipment. So we need to keep our eyes open on that. We're going to do a video in the autumn once that is launched, so we know more details about it. The other one, we've probably heard a lot of it in the press, SFI, Sustainable Farm Incentive. It's going to be launched probably in October, and we can enter it as farmers next spring, where you can apply for additional payments for good farming practice. Basically, there's different levels that you can enter in at, and you'll end up being paid, you know, pounds per hectare for different sort of management styles. You know, and I suppose the further you go with it, the more payments you get. So we've got the SFI that's coming, and I think probably one of the most sort of important schemes which is launched already is the Future Farming Resilience Fund. There's a great sort of mouthful, isn't it? The FFRF. But in summary, the DEFRA is funding free advice to the farmer at the farm. So we're one of the, I suppose you could call it service providers at that. So we'll come to the farm, meet the farmer, we will gather information from you, we'll do a business health check, we'll look at some key performance indicators, and also we'll look at the resilience of your building to the reduction of BPS. And sort of have a brainstorming session about alternative ways that you can generate more income from that. So I think that's an opportunity all farmers should be going into now, and quite easy. Just register via our website to get that free funded or DEFRA funded advice.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, Anita. That concludes today's video. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch. Our next video will be released towards the end of October and will concentrate on the future of environmental stewardship, natural capital and carbon. If you've got any queries with regards to the content covered in today's video, please do go to the website where your local Brown&Co office's details can be found. Thank you very much.